we've had, as I mentioned at the beginning there, we've had quite an array of, no pun intended, of different data and so on presented to us. So an awful lot of meat here for discussion. So we had the paper by Johan, first of all, telling us about Norway, Sweden and Denmark. We had Angus of the First in the Water claim talking to us in relation to the work in the marine zone, the first paper we had on the marine zone, then Lorraine on the D, Matt then talking about work up in the Moray Firth, and finally Niall then talking to us about the West Coast. So let me throw it open and see who wants to be first off in terms of question to any of the speakers. Yes, Ted.
Thanks. There's a lot of talk in a lot of the presentations about estimation of swimming speed and trying to determine the behavior of the fish relative to the water, I assume in some way, or determine how they're behaving in their outward migration. But as I say, in all the measures of swimming speed, I was unable to detect whether any of them were actually measuring the speed of the fish through the water rather than just the speed over the ground. And whether, if they were only measuring the speed over the ground, whether they'd done anything to measure the tidal currents. I mean, Neil, just in that last presentation, obviously is beginning to think about this now, but when I haven't tracked fish for 25 years, but when we were tracking fish, you know, we did use current meters. We used floats with tags in to try and determine exactly what the fish was doing relative to the water, not over the ground. And I just wonder whether any of the presenters actually have a bit more information on the actual swimming behavior of the fish through the water, which seems to be rather an important factor.
I certainly know on the West Coast, in terms of looking at the movements of sea lice, I know that Stuart Mildenmas did some fantastic work looking at the movements of the current, so that can be integrated, I think, with the tracking. Johan, you want to go to make a comment?
Yeah, Ted, I didn't provide that data, but we have current meters in the system as well, so we can distinguish between fish moving over the ground and also in relation to the actual current in the system at different points. So those data is available as well.
Yeah, so we also have used the Scottish shelf model to get water velocities at each of our receiver points. And so we're hopefully looking to tie in the smolt movements to that as well. But that's a lot further down the line.
Thanks. I think Neil wants to make
got relatively crude corrections for current at the moment. We've basically got outputs from the shelf model, and I've made some adjustments just in testing. But we've actually, rather than me just play around with data and that I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing with, we've actually handed it off to James Ownsley to have a slightly more in-depth look at. So it's in the works really, but it's not really ready for to be presented today at least. So.
Thanks very much, James. So basically, James Ownsley is at the moment devising a range of models which will be combining the outputs from the Scottish shelf model with notional swimming vectors from smolts. And that should define the range of options that one would expect smolts to have to adopt if they're to break loose, if you like, and make their way north. So the key issue then is to get some empirical data from around Scotland so that some real data can be compared with what the model predictions are. So very much currents are being integrated with this work.
I'll go over there. I'll run over there. Should have two microphones. Quite a lot of the studies have shown that there's quite a big loss of tags in fresh water, and the generalists, and indeed that was what we found when we did the work on the Tweed, and Neil did that for us several years ago. But how do we know that smolts that have a surgically implanted tag into them are not compromised to the extent that they become more easy prey for the predators? So it may just not be predators, it may not be tags, it's a combination of both. Could it not be? And do we not need to sort that one out before we start making assumptions about predation loss?
Yeah, I just have to address this a little bit, as this is my main research area, is evaluation of tagging effects. Ken kind of tried to persuade me to come here and talk about birds, which I really don't want. So actually I can, if you will allow me to use the lunch break for something good info, I got a very nice presentation on evaluation of tagging effects that we have been doing now for about 20 years. We have done short-term, long-term, mid-term effects. We have looked at growth, behavior, reproduction. We have been looking at mortality, of course, which is a very crude way of measuring the effects. But I actually also did several studies on predator and prey interactions with tagged fish compared to untagged fish. And it's not an easy thing, and it's not easy to say clearly that this is it. What we have to deal with, and with what Matt have to deal with big time now, is to find a common denominator in terms of size and saying how low can we go on those sizes. When I see people here have been using V7 tags on fish that are 12, 13 centimeters, I'm like, we wouldn't do that. I mean, it's not a question of 2% rule or all that crap. It's a question of what can you fit into a fish and have it. And the only way to do that is to do it and look at these fish. So the way I've been doing it, I tag my fish in all sizes with different types of tagging methods and leave them in the river for half a year, go out, catch each and every one of them again, scrutinize them, see how they're doing, and do predator interaction studies too with untagged fish, comparing with tagged fish. We have done that in the River Gudnon back in '97. We released a whole bunch of untagged fish and surgical implanted fish with radio tags, and we looked at because we had a trap downstream, of course, so we could see how many do we lose of each. And luckily, so far, we have not seen any significant effects of tagging. So you can actually say that tagged and untagged smolts migrating downstream are equally vulnerable to predation. I'm going to show you that in the presentation a little bit from here now too. But it's a very important thing, and I think you guys here are starting up now for a lot of the things that we have been doing for a long time. So many of things we think is self-evident because it's in the literature. It's still in the old fart literature that we wrote 20 years ago. So maybe we should refresh that a little bit, and that's why I think it's great that you got Matt in here, and I hope he can do a job in kind of helping us make a standard operational procedure for these things. Because when you lose your fish in the river, definitely, what is it? Is it predation? Is it predation because of the tagging? Is it predation because of the handling? Is it predation because of the release of the fish? Because that's also things. So it's a whole combination. But we have data. They are not 100% conclusive in all circumstances, but it's possible to do it, and I would be happy to help anybody who would like to look at that. I can tell you there's a big audience for these tagging effects, especially in the US. They tend to write to me every time they have something to do there, and I'm like, well, you guys tagged hundreds and hundreds of thousands of fish in the Columbia River, and you did all these evaluations, yeah, but we didn't publish them. I mean, they have them there. They have big fat reports. They tried refining the methods in each and every possible thinkable way. You can talk about Dale about that, but there's a lot of that. So go and look at the literature first, and then make good questions and make little pre-studies.
Yeah, I'd just add on to that I think one of the big issues is we've got a lot of variability in the way that especially actually people are capturing these fish by lots of different methods, potentially in handling them, which is often not described very much in methods. Unlike the tagging, a lot of the handling information and how fish are subsequently released is missed out. The timing of whether these are early maturing salmon smolts that are perhaps losing their scales less easily compared to late captured smolts, whether caught by angling or electric fishing or in rotary screw traps. I think those handling issues need to be dealt with as well.
Okay. One other point I would make, it struck me when Angus was giving his fine paper. There was a meeting last week. I'm involved a bit with environmental DNA, and there's a colleague of mine, Jens Carlson, working with me, and our biggest problem is people don't actually publish the material where the experiment doesn't work. And certainly in the context of eDNA, you'd read the stuff and you think it was all very simple. I thought Angus did a fine job today being very honest with us in terms of the amount of material he was able to collect on either receivers not working or doubts about things that didn't work. That's really important that we actually put an emphasis on that and learn from it. This stuff is difficult and it is very much down to interpretation, and I think that message needs to go out very clearly. You know? Any other points? Yes, Dave.
Yeah, I had a comment or a question in relation to Johan's presentation and then Lorraine's also. In Johan's presentation, I believe he said the smolt were going out, they seemed to separate in two groups, one going quicker than the other. In Lorraine's presentation, she mentioned the D harbor, every fish behaved the same except for one, and it did something differently. So my question is, are you both sure that you're still tracking salmon smolts, or are you tracking something else in those different cases? Or, well, sorry, in your case, sea trout smolts, but is it a sea trout smolt inside of some other fish? That's the question I would have that's behaving something differently.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a huge amount, there's a huge amount of pike in the system as well. So of course that could be the case that we would track other fish. But we were also trying to, those fish that was hanging around, we did manual tracking of those as well in order to make sure that they were either dead or with different fish. And they were quite often caught in the estuary as sea trout, so they were definitely sea trout. So otherwise that could have been the case that they were being captured. But and also the other study also supports this finding that there are two different clusters. And why there are two different clusters, I don't know, but that is something that we would like to dig into, if there's sort of physiological differences or behavioral difference between these.
Thank you. Yes, someone at the back there, yeah. Thank you.
Good exercise. Thank you. Sorry about that. It's to Neil's presentation. There was a rather telling conclusion that from the Loch Linney study, which I think was from the inner part of the loch, that salmon rapidly go to sea. And from what I could see of the sea loch, I wasn't entirely sure that you could deduce that from the positioning of the receivers. I wonder if you could amplify a little bit more on that. That was a contentious question you might have expected to have received.
So yeah, the receivers are actually set up in gates when they're leaving the inner loch, and really when you get to Corran Narrows, the sort of currents there are so strong that they actually can drag a mooring away, so you actually lose a receiver if you try and even put it there. So they're tracked up to Corran Narrows. So you've got this network of gates along the loch that you can work out how they get out to sea.
But certainly, from what I understand of Mull and the sound of Mull, the sea itself is not the sea at that point in the inner loch. So certainly sea trout in their movements were shown that they stayed within a zone that was beyond where those, in the coastal zone beyond where those receivers were. So whether you could differentiate in the same way between sea trout and salmon, that they had very different behavioural patterns, I'm just questioning that. Certainly from a planning perspective in terms of the siting of future sea cages.
Thanks, Neil. I think, to be fair, I think it's very much obviously an initial study. So they're the very areas that John was making reference to, I think, in terms of trying to integrate this then with the currents to try and make sense of it. And it's going to take a number of years, I think, before we begin to make sense of that. But I think it's very important. Yes, John?
I think if I'm understanding correctly, though, what the data from a number of studies now suggests is that the sea trouts, a large proportion of the sea trouts, stay really quite close in. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah.
It's really what the salmon do.
The salmon move really quite rapidly through Loch Linney.
Through Loch Linney.
Yeah, and the next study was looking at what do they do when they then reach the Isle of Mull. So that maybe wasn't quite clear. So we now have tracks through Loch Linney and out past the Isle of Mull. And the next question is, what happens next?
Thanks, John. Any more questions? Oh yes, one at the back there.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a general comment. We've seen a number of acoustic studies this morning and some yesterday. And I think generally when they're set up, people are setting out their last array as the point that they want to track the smolts to, or the fish to. And what they're often doing as well is they're trying to measure the efficiency at that array, and they're using sentinel tags, and they're using various techniques to try to measure the efficiency of that last array. But I think probably a better way to go about it would be not to try and measure the efficiency of that last array with sentinel tags or whatever, but rather to set a second array, couple the arrays, so have another array that's outside of your last array that you're interested in, and use that last array, this extra array, if you like, to measure the efficiency of your last array of interest. Basically what it does is it changes the problem from just trying to see what the smolt are doing and where they're being detected into a capture mark recapture experiment, so that your last array of interest, the efficiency of that is detected, is estimated from the number of fish that are seen, as a proportion of those that are. Sorry, I find it difficult to explain. So your last array, the outer array, this extra array, is basically testing the efficiency of your inner array, and it allows you to detect to estimate the efficiency of that your last array of interest using the data from the fish. So it's at the time that the fish are moving. It allows for variable fish behavior. When you go out and you do your range testing, I'm not entirely convinced all the time that you're covering the full suite of possible conditions under which those fish might be moving. Rather than do that, just allow the fish, their movement at the time that they move and the conditions that they move under, and this second array, this extra array, to calculate and estimate what those efficiencies are. So it's basically, you can't use a single receiver. You can, and I'm sure in many cases the range testing, people are taking it very seriously, this imperfect detection issue, taking it very seriously, and they're doing quite extensive range testing. So I'm quite convinced that in most cases what we're saying is true, but why not, rather than do all that extra range testing and take that risk, why not just invest a little more cash if you can into a couple more receivers and put them outside of your last array and measure the efficiency empirically?
I just quickly like to add to Stephen's, I think what Stephen is advocating is not for a complete full array where you're trying to, excuse me, last night must have been tough. It's not to try and put a new complete array out, because that can obviously be very expensive. You don't actually need to do that. You just need to have a few receivers out there that gives you an estimate of the efficiency of the previous array. You don't need to try and detect all the fish in these extra detectors, but they will actually give you a measure of, based on the fish behavior, what was the efficiency of your last point of interest.
Two microphones next time.
So just to kind of go along with, it's Stephen, right? Yeah, just to kind of go along with what you were saying, we, in 2015, I'm with the Atlantic Salmon Federation, we have a gate at the Strait of Belle Isle, and what we did in 2015 was we put a second array out so that we could try and estimate survival to that point, because that's what we were kind of interested in doing. And last year, it's just 1 year's data, we had sentinel tags and used logistic regression along with the simulation, kind of like what Matt has done, to try and estimate the efficiency of that gate and compare that to really similar estimates to the probability detection based on a CJS model. And we're finding that the simulation model is biased quite high, usually by about 20% more than what the CJS model is saying. So yeah, I think that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, so on the whole, I think some of our newer array designs actually contain 2 lines now. So, you know, it's a very pertinent point to make. So, it does come down to cost, though. So, I mean, how much budget do you have to buy receivers? I think one of the things is you can actually make rather than just have a straight line, you could probably try and stagger your receivers of overlapping fields potentially, and that way you could actually have a bit of slack for if you actually miss on one receiver.
Could I raise an issue, if I might? It's just a comment that Matt made in relation to the number of detections he had to deal with, because I can remember John Armstrong joined me for a meeting with Lorraine and with Mark and some others in 2015 when we were thinking about the whole idea of trying to support an initiative on the SPAY or on the D at the time. And John made the comment to us in relation to the amount of data that a relatively simple program of this nature can actually generate, and we love to see the dots on the maps and so on, but behind that is a huge amount of analysis. And I just wanted to get some comments, if I could, in terms of how fit for purpose we are in terms of expanding out these sort of programs and dealing with the sort of data sets that they're going to generate. Yes. Niels.
Sorry, it's a very good point, and I was always going to try to warn anybody here to tag too many fish and have too many loggers and all that, because the sheer amount of data can really be troublesome. And we had a huge success in a project several years back where we installed a 3D acoustic system in a lake, and we tagged all the predators in the lake and a good proportion of all the prey fish too. So we have perch, roach, and pike, and we could get them live on screen all the time, 24/7 for a year. And the amount of data there has just been drowning us ever since. I mean, we have one guy who was a computer genius sitting there. He made his own script for analyzing these data. But every time he runs something, like I ask him and say, okay, I would like to see how often do the roach actually meet the pike. And he says, how close? I said, well, 1 meter in 2 seconds or so that they can actually see each other. He said, okay, I'll run that. That's easy enough. Just encounter rates. Took the computers like a week just to come out with one. There's billions and billions of calculations. So we have all that data now, which could give us every answer we would if we could put the right questions, but nobody can. I mean, it's so impossible to get it out. So now it's basically a few publications out, and the rest is basically lying there because it's just too heavy. So people are always laughing at me when I say, just tag 10 fish, it's much easier. but sometimes it's actually a good idea to go down, not just because of the 3 R's and the animal welfare people telling us to use fewer and fewer fish. But again, if you want to test things like the range test and so on, it's great to have a lot of fish to go through. And I think the WEMCO stuff is doing it extremely easy to handle data, but you do get a lot, so that's just...
Thank you.
That's a general point that the use of gates and arcs will produce a lot more manageable or less data than grid systems involving triangulation and interpolation, sort of with VPS. As soon as you start to get into that kind of triangulation system, it will produce, you know, orders of magnitude more data, and that certainly needs to be considered.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, Neil? Yeah. Thank you.
I guess really the experimental design and the data collection needs to fit the question you're asking, really. So you don't want to generate so much superfluous data that you can't really process it. So you really just need to pare things down and try and get it down to what you're actually asking initially, and not overburden yourself with so much data. So.
And another issue will also be that it will be hard to standardize and visualize if we use various difficult modeling. And all these scripts that have been run in R, will turn out very difficult to compare different studies if we use different approaches. So it would be a good idea if we could try to standardize it, but we're not there.
Okay. Well, there's certainly ideas for us in the context of the sort of workshops and so on that we organise in the Atlantic Salmon Trust. I mean, ideas in terms of where the gaps are would be really useful to us in terms of knowing how we can actually do that. Because I know from talking to Fred Worski that in terms of OTN, they're putting a huge amount of resource at the moment into that whole question of data, standardising the data for the various VEMCO tags, and I'm sure the same must be ongoing for some of the other companies as well. It's an important point. Yes, of course.
Comment. Something else that I think is worth bearing in mind, and that I've been guilty of in the past, is when we're looking at sort of detection data, there's been a lot of talk about, well, if you don't detect certain tags, then that means these fish have died, and we've talked about what the causes are. No, it doesn't. It means you haven't detected those fish, and so we're much better off thinking about trying to analyse and design our systems where we analyse the positive data, where you've got records of those. The lack of data actually tells us nothing, and it can be as a result of tag failure, which does happen. Now, I've had certain circumstances in the past, doesn't happen as much these days, where 10%, 20% of tags can fail. Hopefully it doesn't happen these days, but there are very few high quality, independently tested evaluations, and just about none in the literature. Secondly, we can get tag losses as a result of expulsion from the fish. And if they're lying on the riverbed, that could be another issue. Thirdly, we can get mortality, which can be not related to predators, could be handling or other natural mortalities. There are all those different causes, and the Norwegians have been pretty good in terms of talking about survival, and I think probably we need to be going down that route as well.